darling.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, good morning. Thank you all for joining us
Pass me one of those waters.
for this conversation with four of the topmost investors at Atomico, a venture firm which is easy to forget is just 13 years old given the impact that it has had on the industry. Today we are going to be talking about the mechanics of Atomico, because I know many of you in the audience are founders and probably want to know better how things work over there. But we're also going to be talking about some industry trends. And toward that end, well, first I want to thank all of you for coming from Switzerland and England and Sweden. I think this is maybe the first time you've all been on stage together, so thank you so much.
That's correct. Thanks for having us.
You recently released a State of the European Tech Report, which you've been doing annually, which I think is very interesting and useful for the industry. And I thought there were so many interesting data points in it. Something like $33 billion was invested in European tech startups in the last year across 4,500 rounds. 20 companies are now home to a unicorn startup, meaning valued at more than $1 billion. Was there anything in the report that you found particularly interesting? Maybe, Niall, do you want to start way down there?
Yeah, well, I think you touched on some of them. I think the landscape of Europe has changed so fundamentally. I remember when I came out of business school like a long time ago, like 20 years ago, it was considered a bit weird to go into early stage tech. And now, you know, everybody wants to be in an amazing startup. So I think culturally it's massively transformed. That's not so much a surprise, I guess, but I think it's just a rousing endorsement of Europe and what we see here that perhaps we didn't, certainly 10 years ago. I think the other area that is perhaps more surprising is that diversity is still not moved on. I think we put out some figures in the report showing, just how few female founders, about 8% of the money that gets put into VC is going to female founders. I actually just invested in a female-founded company myself this year called Koru Kids with an amazing lady, Rachel Carell, running that. So we are seeing some change, but I think in all of our opinion, not enough. I mean, it's maybe something that Sophia would like to comment on, because I know she feels quite passionately about particularly the diversity point.
Well, thanks, Neil. Yeah, I mean, we all do, but for me especially, I find it really important, and I'm proud of Atomico because we have done stuff, not just talking about it. So last year we launched a diversity and inclusion report, so that if a founder don't really know how to go about it, we can point to that and say, like, if you need help creating a diversity plan, this is how you do it.
That's terrific.
And then also we met last year when I was announcing the angel program, and I'm really proud to say that 8 out of the 12 angels in that group are women, and that have been really good at deploying money into female-led companies.
And programs like that are so important. So the numbers that Niall and Sophia are referencing was, yes, 92% of funding you determined had gone to all male founding teams. In the US, frankly, it's not a whole lot better than that. I think it's something like 80%. Things are getting better slowly thanks to women joining traditional venture firms, of course, more attention being paid to the issue, and also more women starting venture funds and sort of making sure they're funding more women founders. Is that a trend that you're seeing in Europe? Are women starting their own firms increasingly? Sophia?
Yeah, I see that quite a bit, actually, which makes me very excited. And I see a whole new generation of both female entrepreneurs and also female investors in all stages, both seed and angel, but also A and growth venture. Also, one of the things that I wanted to achieve with the angel program was to get more people excited about angel investing. And I think we have seen a few of those that have already now started sort of investing after the program, which is for me really, then it comes full circle and then it has meaning. So I want more people and especially more women to come into the world of VC and considering a career as an investment partner.
Sure, I think that momentum.
Just for our own fun, by the way, we've paid a lot of attention to this because it's about how do we also reflect what we're trying to produce in the ecosystem.
Sure.
And we're at a point where we're 40% female on our investment team at this point, which is still not good enough, but we've really prioritized, bringing in more people from diverse backgrounds and more women, and it's paying off. And I think it just makes us better investors, right? So that's first and foremost.
That's terrific. Do you have any idea of what percentage of your founding teams include a woman? Is it hopefully better than?
I think we're probably around the industry average. And, the more recent ones, I think we're above. But if you look at
Right, everyone's getting sort of better more recently.
Yeah.
Another thing that I thought was interesting about the report as an American was the fact that of all this money that's going into these venture firms and startups, $902 million came from pension funds, which is not a lot of money. So I guess most of it is coming from family offices, wealthy individuals. In the US, it's flip-flopped, as you know. What's going on? Is it a structural issue, Hiro? Is it a
I think the
cultural
world
issue?
is waking up to the fact that European venture has comparative performance today with US venture returns. There's research out there that is relatively authoritative in that area that you can kind of point to that the data is we're performing. And as a function of that, yes, you're right. There's pension funds in Europe, roughly 4 trillion that they have under management. $1 billion last year is a 3-fold increase from where it was before. So it is material, but as you say, I think if you think about the 4 trillion that they are managing, it's probably put to good use where you're deploying capital into venture capital funds that are looking to change the world in a positive way, because that is what impacts the pensioners who are behind that capital.
Sure.
I think that hopefully we'll continue to see that trend because it is happening and there is improvement, but there's more to do there.
Before we move on from the report, one other thing that I thought was interesting was that though all the sort of lines are moving in the right direction, VCs in Europe had raised $13 billion in funding, which is like a third of the money that went into startups. So that means a lot of money is coming from elsewhere. I just wondered, where is that money coming from? Siraj?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the way it should be, right? When companies mature, the companies that we think should be coming from Europe, a lot of the ones we looked at back, are by ambition global companies. And being global companies, that also means having investors from other regions. So it's not a bad thing. I don't think we should be, as investors, saying, well, the funding has to all come from here. I think it's a sign of success that European companies are getting investments from Chinese investors, from US investors, which is really what's happening. It's to Hiro's point.
Yeah, and to couple to that is the fact that the universe of tech is expanding to involve many industries.
Sure.
And so, what is naturally happening as a course of that is a lot of different types of capital, strategic, corporate, individuals, they're all getting involved in what is actually happening. I think that it's a reflection of where tech is going, or has been going for the last, several years, if not decade.
Right. Well, I also wondered if, because of this ongoing trade war between the US and China, you were seeing more funding specifically coming from China, if that's something that you can sort of see quite yet, or perhaps not.
I mean, there's an interesting point there, which is certain kinds of companies, which particularly a lot of frontier deep tech companies that are considered sensitive, Europe is kind of neutral grounds, right? So we can get customers, not just investors, but also customers from the US, customers from China. And there are examples like Graphcore, one of our portfolio companies, where this is tech that is not labored with restrictions that might come with the ongoing spat. That's an advantage for Europe.
And can I ask too, so another big trend in the US that's been going on for 10 or 15 years, talking about tech affecting everything and everyone sort of looking to invest in tech, is there's much more money from the Middle East, sovereign wealth funds that has come into the US. I just wondered, and now I guess, given the sort of less than impeachable human rights records of some of these regions, there's a lot of debate in the US about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, whether people should be taking money. Do European startups care? Do European venture capital firms care?
I think so. I think everyone cares not only about, what they're doing in terms of where, impact to the world, but what type of capital they are choosing. And I think, more and more people are becoming, and founders and entrepreneurs are clearly sensitive, and the people who are tackling big missions and big problems are clearly sensitive in terms of alignment with their investors. And I think that is something that will continue to be a trend that we see with the matching of the type of capital, the investor, and the entrepreneur. And so, of course, I think that definitely will be a continued trend that we see.
Yeah, and just we're very selective with our LPs, right? I mean, we're careful, and a lot of our LPs are pension funds, which it's a really nice virtuous cycle. The fact that it's like pensioners are doing well off of the investment performance that we're working hard to deliver, and then the founders can feel good about the fact that their investors are indirectly, in many cases, you know, the majority of money may be pensioners.
That's great. So you anticipated my next question, which was who your LPs are. So it's pension funds, it's also family offices, and it's mostly European, or also a mix of.
I think we're kind of diverse. I don't have the stats at hand, but it is mainly European, I'd say, yeah.
And you're right now investing a $765 million fund that you closed in 2017. I believe I read, it might have been in TechCrunch.com, that you are raising another fund. Are we going to surpass $1 billion this time, Sophia?
You know what? We don't say more than that at this time. We're always fundraising, and you'll be the first to know when we have news on that field.
Back to the U.S. and Trump. It's a very polarizing experience that Americans are going through there. I mean, you're sort of living through it, I guess, Hiro, a little bit in London with Brexit. I'm just wondering, are you seeing founders less inclined to want to move to the U.S. because things are a little bit less stable there in many ways than historically?
I don't know if that's a trend. I do see, however, that founders, at least in Europe, are more and more encouraged. They're very keen on building the business in Europe, and I think that, to me, is they're building global businesses in Europe, which doesn't mean that they, you know, traverse borders. They are in the U.S. Their products are in Asia, but they are trying to build massive businesses here in Europe, which I think is an incredibly encouraging component that supersedes any, you know, political realm. I think that is what I see. I would defer to my colleagues as well.
No, I mean 100%. The trend, that the opportunity and the need to go to Silicon Valley to do something is, I'm not saying that's not a good choice, but I think you have as much, if not a greater opportunity here, because the talent is amazing here, the size of the market is amazing here, increasingly the capital is here. Back to the previous point about sources of capital, the best entrepreneurs here do have now choice, and they are being selective about where they take their capital from as well. Just sort of kind of a little bit why we're sitting here, which is that therefore even the VCs have to be really on their game that perhaps they weren't 20 years ago, and we have to differentiate ourselves. And what Atomico are trying to do is differentiate ourselves by being, yes, investment professionals, but also a bunch of ex-operators like myself, ex-founders like Siraj, and bringing a different mix to the game, because the best founders do have choice. You know, interesting stat I read the other day that in UK VC, only 4% of the people in UK VC firms had operational tech company experience. Now in our investment...
I'm sorry, what percentage?
4%.
Oh, just 4?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
And in Atomico, 70% of our investment team have been in early stage tech businesses. And that is why we try and bring a differentiated proposition. Yes, we're bringing you money, but we're bringing you know-how. People, like myself, who've been around the block in many, successful and, not so successful businesses, learned some good things, but also made a bunch of mistakes.
Sure.
And sitting alongside people who are at the start of their journey is something that we're hearing loud and clear from the market as differentiating what we're bringing to the table versus just pure money. Siraj is an ex-founder himself. I mean, I don't know if you want to add to that, but there's a reason probably you're...
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I spent most of my professional life in the Valley, 13 years, and at 2 startups. The first one was Google in 2001, and then the second was my own. And my startup, Climate Corporation, we had 4 rounds of funding with 6 top-tier investor names. And I got to know the VC industry from the other side. And it was very clear to me the value add of the founder-funded VC, where it's not just the money, it's the experience and the collective mistakes that people have made and can share with you. So for me, the Atomico model was and still is, the best way, which is why it was an easy decision for me to come and join.
I think it's terrific. I also am really shocked by that number because I think in the US it's become so competitive that it would be very hard to be a VC without operational experience. People still do it, but by and large, it's very crucial for the reasons that you outlined. Another trend that you kind of touched on in the report, very big in the US, seems like it's the case here too, companies staying private longer. Is that good, bad, neutral? Sophia, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, I don't know, but from my experience with Spotify, it takes time to build a good company. And it takes time to build a big, successful, global category winner. So I think it's healthy that you take the time and then you go public when the time is right. And
is that sort of the uniform?
I think, the rule of thumb is that if you're trying to get bigger outcomes that have a lot of challenges along the way, that you have to disrupt existing industries, many different mechanics of the commercialization of some of the services and technology will take longer. Therefore, staying private serves that serves that goal. And I think it allows you to take longer duration, execution cycles to get there. Clearly, in businesses like tech, where there are a lot of things to solve, that is a natural fit. And I think that is why over the last decade we have seen that trend of companies staying private longer. And I do think that there's a lot of benefit in that cycle being long. And the capital is there for that.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I mean, I've been lucky enough to be through two companies from early through going public, through IPO. One, Betfair, $6-7 billion business in London, and Uber, which you all know. And definitely it took us a long time in both those cases to get to where we wanted to do. But also there are very different pressures on a company once it's gone public. And I certainly saw from the inside that as I say, the pressure on us as a management team running some of these businesses as private were very, very different to the public pressures of quarterly earnings and all of those things. And so in many ways, the aspects that we're looking for to create amazing companies are protected within a private environment because it allows people to try stuff, iterate, make mistakes in a way that the public markets are very unforgiving on. So I think that's an aspect that's led to this trend as well.
I don't know if anyone here happens to know what the average age is of a company going public in Europe. In the United States, it's hit 13 years, which is pretty amazing to me as somebody who's covered the industry for so long. One issue, though, seems to be this disconnect between what private investors think a company is worth and public investors. Uber's obviously been sort of struggling with this. Is that something as investors you're kind of increasingly concerned with as you see some of these companies go out and get sort of hammered down by public market shareholders?
I think as you grow into a later stage cycle of company development, it becomes more and more of a sensitivity that one has to think about, both as a founder and a group of investors who are committed to a company. I think where we focus on as an organization, as a fund, is much more at the early stage. Our primary activity is Series A European companies. We've doubled down on that over the last several years because we feel like that is where the opportunity is. Now, at that point in time, I think it's much less about the valuations that will be the public or the disconnect between public and private. I think it's much more about, the value of growing a business that is tackling a big problem or a big opportunity. And it's probably not as relevant in the immediate term as for us that it is. But as we all have, either currently or have in the past been part of big exits and growing companies, I think even in our portfolio, those are things that we need to think about as investors, and some of our companies are growing to that nature. So it's not, again, something that over time we currently have to deal with that as well.
But you do have a growth stage business, so on that front you probably have to pay a little bit more attention.
Yes, I think that to be thoughtful and mindful about what a company's valuation is obviously, as that moment approaches in terms of maybe an IPO or any other kind of event that would create liquidity, we do have to think about that, but I think it's a much more collaborative discussion with founders and entrepreneurs so that they succeed and that they have the maximum amount of optionality, as well as what we talked about before, which is that elasticity to do things in a way that only private companies can do. So that's in the balance.
You know, another thing
these disconnects will continue to exist, right? And particularly when there are charismatic founders and large valuations involved, it'll be quite newsworthy. But let's not forget, you know, there is a fundamental bedrock of very good companies that are being built here, and we should not overfit to the news of the moment, you know, where a particular company might have had issues.
A gap in valuation. What about secondaries? So because companies are staying so long, I mean, so private so long in the US, you know, employees want to get some liquidity, founders want to get some liquidity. Is that acceptable here? Are there sort of companies that have sprung up to facilitate these exchanges?
There are funds, yeah. There are funds that do secondaries, and I mean, for us as investors, our perspective is, you know, we don't want people to be living hand to mouth and on shoestring salaries. So when we invest, sometimes the right thing to do is to have, even as part of a round, you know, some degree of secondaries, but like small enough that people still maintain their hunger. But you know, living's expensive, and people should be focused on their business, not because they can't make their paychecks. Are
they typically other venture funds, though, that are buying these shares, or is it other?
I think it's everybody, because in some way, this whole, you know, the underlying denominator is the duration of staying private, and you know, value is still being created, even if a company is private. So therefore, to get alignment, you know, there has to be ability for founders and those who are employees, and you know, all those stakeholders need to have the ability to, you know, find value along the way and recognize and realize that value. So yes, it is funds. Yes, it is the world is becoming much more kind of sophisticated in the layers of different types of capital there is. So yes, there are people who specialize, but there are also those who are incorporating that into their primary investment strategy as well. So I think it's a mix.
Makes a lot of sense. Direct listings. Anybody care about these? Is that the wave of the future? Do IPOs need to be rethought? A lot of talk about this in Silicon Valley.
I think it's a great development. It's, again, a sign that I think, you know, technology and the underpinning capital that supports entrepreneurs and business builders is becoming sophisticated. Direct listings, you know, I mean, I started my career in technology and internet and web in the late 90s. You know, that's something that we would have never thought about. I think today it allows for companies to have different types of access to capital in a way that, you know, is ever evolutionary, and I think that's a wonderful thing.
Sure. And Sophia, your former CFO, of course, gets a lot of credit for sort of inventing the whole process. Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about, so the four of you came from your different offices. How many offices are there together now managed by Atomico?
Well, in terms of offices, we're based out of London, which is where our core headquarters, 80% of our people are there. But we have people dotted around the place. Sophia's on the ground in Stockholm looking after the Nordics, as an example. We have somebody based in Paris looking after Francophone region. So we have offices dotted around the place because we're a pan-European fund, and therefore that's helpful both for sourcing, but also for supporting entrepreneurs. So yeah, that's geographically kind of how we're split. And that sort of, as I said, maps our investment strategy of being a pan-European fund primarily. We do some later stage stuff as well, which my colleague Hiro leads, okay. And that can be anywhere, including the US as well. But yeah, we're really focused on pan-European. You know, we're one of the largest VC funds, I think the largest founder-led VC fund tackling European venture capital.
I did want to ask, one of your co-founders is starting his own seed stage fund, Matthias Jungmann. Why? I guess why is he doing this separately from Atomico?
So we don't do seed stage investing, and you know, Matthias is great. It's been a passion of his for quite some time. So you know, we are the first investors in his new fund. So we believe in him. It's very much part of the family.
That's great. I did not realize you don't do any seed stage investing, but you do A through later stage.
So our sweet spot is A. So I would say 70% of our target investment is at A. So check sizes of 5 to 15, looking at 15 to 20% equity ownership at that stage. We will do Bs and Cs. I think most people would know that about our kind of fund. Perhaps what they don't know is that we're also recently this year restructured to have a bit more focus about sectors. So for example, I look at consumer, Hiro looks at late venture, Siraj looks at deep tech or frontier as we call it. Sophia also works with me in consumer, and we also cover enterprise, B2B. So we've really started to, be much more focused on those separate areas. We work as a team, of course, but it gives us a lot more insight and specialization in those 4 areas. And that's something that people probably didn't know about us now.
That's great, and thank you for surfacing that. And then in terms of decision making, how does that work? Do you and Sophia come together to talk about consumer deals, or is this a firm-wide decision that has to be made?
Our decision-making process is incredibly collaborative because we have a diverse set of partners with diverse sets of experience. So what we try to do is bring that diversity of experience into our decision-making thought process to then have one very good decision. So it is incredibly inclusive, or at least we believe that to be the case.
Totally, and the common thread running across all of us is, we have this term internally, partners to game changers. We really view ourselves as partners to game-changing companies. And what does that mean? I mean, there are a lot of great companies that are not game changers per se. For us, it's which are the companies that are really making a difference, defining new categories, building global businesses. And we think that's absolutely necessary because we're at this point in time where we're faced with these huge crises, from the climate crisis to the disunity amongst people and so on. And this next decade is one where it's mission critical for humanity to start to solve some of these problems. So for us, the common thread is what we're doing. If it's a net positive, that's the best scenario, but it should definitely be not a net negative. And in that, we're united. When we have these discussions, is this a game-changing company? Is it not negative to the world? And then, of course, as investors, it has to be a good investment for us.
And Siraj, if you don't mind my asking you to sort of close this conversation, I wish we had more time, but I know that you're sort of focused on frontier tech.
Yeah.
Atomico's got some really interesting bets, GraphCore, as you mentioned, Lilium, the flying taxi company, which I talked to Nicholas about a couple of years ago when it was first announcing maybe it's like a 10 million Series A. Going into 2020, what's next toward that point you were making?
Yeah, so it's very much that point. We have these huge challenges ahead of us, and companies that are able to solve those challenges or help contribute towards them will really flourish, and there's a lot of interesting scope for us as investors there. So there are many of these. I mean, AI continues to develop. We're starting to move from predictions to agency. That's a really interesting step. Biology has got to a point where we're not just using it to treat diseases. Now we can create systems of biology. We can create new computers. We can create air purifiers. We can create all kinds of things that are basically built out of biology, not out of mechanics. And quantum computers, there's a whole long list of interesting things. But the common thread is solving humanity's biggest problems, and that we really need to do that. It's time for that.
Absolutely. More attention needs to be paid. Thank you so much, all of you, for flying, and we so appreciate it. Love talking to you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all.